Engines stopped. Borders closed. They said Ghana and Burkina Faso were seconds from war, trucks stranded in the dust, rumors spilling like oil across the Sahel. But what if this tension was never about trade or transit? What if the border was only the surface of a deeper quake? Because while two nations argued over roads, a third was quietly rewriting the rules beneath them. In Niger, the silence didn't mean peace, it meant preparation. And when that silence broke, the entire region would understand what this storm was truly about. Then the silence spoke. Not through speeches, but through a broadcast. RTN's signal cut through the static. Les forces de défense et de sécurité ont conduit plusieurs operations. The words fell like coordinates. Operation Damissa, Dosso and Bulbul. Operation Almahaou, Tilaberi. Operation Naya, Wanzerbe. No slogans. No applause. Just names, each one a front line drawn in the sand. The Republic had answered the rumors, not with denial, but with precision. And as the map of Niger lit up with movement, the world began to realize. This wasn't a reaction, it was a plan unfolding. The broadcast ended, but the signal did not fade. It lingered in the air like a vibration, as if the Republic had spoken in a language only the desert could translate. The world thought Niger was reacting to rumors. But in truth, it was revealing a sequence that had been set in motion long before the headlines. Damissa. Almahaou. Naya. 3 words that sounded ordinary, yet carried the weight of a strategy older than the crisis itself. When the first convoys left Dosso before sunrise, there were no reporters, no speeches. Only dust rising behind armored trucks and the silent precision of men who had memorized every inch of the terrain. Operation Damissa unfolded without spectacle. It wasn't the loud kind of war the world had come to expect from Africa. It was quiet, almost surgical, a reclamation disguised as routine. In the villages along Bulbul, people stepped out of their homes not to flee but to watch. They didn't cheer, they didn't wave flags, they simply stood still, understanding what outsiders could not. After years of waiting, their soldiers had returned not to promise safety, but to enforce it. By mid-morning, radio transmissions confirmed it, the insurgent cells had been neutralized. Their caches destroyed, their routes reclaimed. The FDS did not stay to celebrate. They moved on, leaving behind nothing but order and the faint echo of engines fading toward the horizon. Damissa was not a battle, it was an announcement written in movement. It told the Sahel that Niger had chosen action over appeal, precision over panic. A few days later, the second signal appeared. Tilaberi, the western edge, a landscape foreign journalists once called the graveyard of plans. To those who had studied the Sahel only through maps, it was just a corridor of dunes and forgotten villages. But to Niger, it was the nerve of sovereignty. Operation Almahaou began at midday, when the light was cruel and shadows vanished. The Aksongo drones rose like steel birds, tracing invisible lines across the sky. Below, units advanced without haste. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. The strike was swift, 1 minute of silence, then a pulse of sound that shook the sand. When the dust settled, 15 camps were gone. No enemy footage. No chaos. Just coordinates erased. The discipline was almost unnerving. Observers abroad expected statements, instead, they received silence. Yet that silence was louder than any declaration. It said that Niger no longer fought for validation. It fought for endurance. In Niamey, the operation room glowed in red and green. Each fading dot on the map marking a reclaimed pocket of control. The commander's words were few: confirm. Advance. Secure. Nothing more. The nation's voice had changed, it spoke now through precision. Almahaou proved what Damissa had whispered, that the Republic's greatest strength was not its weapons, but its patience. Then came Naya. The third and most demanding. conducted under a moon that barely existed. In the wastelands of Wanzerbe where sound itself seemed to die. It was a campaign of invisibility. Soldiers moved without headlights, radio chatter reduced to code. Even the wind seemed to conspire in silence. There were no witnesses, only results. By dawn, the corridors that fed the northern routes were cleared, the insurgent presence dissolved like mist. Naya was not a victory of firepower. It was a victory of restraint. To strike without destroying, to control without conquering, that was the art. The FDS learned to build while fighting, to stabilize as they advanced. Roads were reopened not by aid, but by resolve. What was once a ghost region now pulsed with activity, caravans moving, farmers returning, children walking home through paths that had been deadly weeks before. The transformation was not loud, but it was absolute. In the cafés of Niamey, people began to speak differently. They no longer said insecurity. They said order. Not waiting. But return. The change in vocabulary meant more than policy. It meant identity. For the first time in years, the Republic was not being described by others, it was describing itself. Foreign analysts, always eager to label, struggled to interpret. Some called it new militarism, others defensive nationalism. But they missed the essence. What Niger demonstrated was not militarism, it was mastery. The mastery of movement, of timing, of silence. The refusal to let chaos dictate rhythm. In a region where disorder had become an industry, Niger's calm felt revolutionary. By the end of Naya, the triad was complete. 3 fronts, 1 intent. The world counted casualties, Niger counted distances reclaimed. The West measured success in headlines, the Republic measured it in kilometers of road secured. In markets reopened, in children who could sleep through the night. What Damissa began, Almahaou expanded, and Naya confirmed. Together, they redrew the psychological map of the Sahel, proving that sovereignty was not a declaration, but a discipline. The people of Dosso, Talabere, and Wanzerbe didn't see these operations as war, they saw them as repair. A restoration of rhythm, of confidence, of trust in the nation's own hands. By the time RTN broadcast the summary, objectives achieved, region secured, there was no need for ceremony. The celebration was already in the silence that followed. In Niamey, a soldier folded the national flag after the briefing. In Dosso, a farmer reopened the irrigation channel that had been abandoned since the first attacks. In Wanzerbe, a school bell rang again. Those were the sounds of victory, small, human, permanent. The desert does not record applause. It records footprints. And across its vastness, the traces of the FDS were clear. Stretching in perfect lines from south to north, like the stitches of a continent mending itself. If you had stood there, at dusk, watching the last convoy return, you might not have heard music or speeches. You would have heard something quieter, the sound of a nation breathing evenly for the first time in years. And in that breath lay the truth that no analyst, no report could translate. That Niger had not just defended its land. It had redefined what strength means. If that strength resonates with you, hold on to it. Because history does not repeat itself, it waits for those who recognize its rhythm. When the operations in Niger ended, the noise of victory faded, but something heavier remained, the weight of discipline. The dust that rose from Dosso drifted westward, carried by the Sahel winds. Until it reached the border between Ghana and Burkina Faso. There, the echo of Niger's precision transformed into a different kind of confrontation, not of weapons, but of will. Trucks stood still for miles, engines silent under the desert sun. Drivers cursed, rumors spread, cameras arrived. The world called it a border crisis. But for those who understood the rhythm of what was happening across Africa, this was not chaos. It was continuity. The same pulse that moved through Niger's silence now beat through the asphalt of West Africa. 2 nations, Ghana and Burkina Faso, found themselves arguing not about ideology, but about endurance. How long can a nation protect what it builds before it collapses under its own weight? In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traore stood firm. His voice was calm, unwavering. Our roads are built for 50 tons, he said. When you carry 120, you destroy in weeks what took years to build. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea for respect, for structure, for order, for self-preservation. And across the border, Ghana's President John Dramani Mahama responded, not in anger, but in reflection. His words, broadcast in Accra, were both confession and correction.
Load their trucks and destroy the roads in 3 to 5 years. We've seen new roads that are built, and once these trucks that are overloaded pass on them, within 3 to 5 years, the road is finished. Recently, Burkina Faso have implemented a new weight regulation. And so your trailer must not be longer than a certain length. It must not be wider than a certain length. And do you know what is happening? Trucks load from Takrady and from Tema and overload. When they get to Burkina Faso border, they cannot enter because of the regulation the Burkinabes have introduced. So they bring 3 trucks from Burkina Faso and offload 1 truck into 3 trucks before they can enter Burkina Faso. There are trucks in this country that load 120 tons when the maximum load is supposed to be 50 tons. There is no road you can construct that will stand 20 tons per truck. And so I've told the roads minister, and it's going to be announced firmly in the budget, we'll consult the drivers' union, the transporters. We must implement weight restrictions so that the roads that we build can last. And so next year, we're going to introduce strict weight limitations so that these investments that we're making in our road sector would last for a lifetime. We are not going to waste taxpayers' money repairing these roads only for people who want to make as much money as possible to load 120 tons on a road and destroy that road within a short time. And so I'm just sending a signal. We're going to engage the stakeholders in the sector in order that we enforce the weight limits for our trucks so that they don't overload and destroy our roads.
The world heard a policy speech. Africa heard a turning point. For the first time, 2 leaders on opposite sides of a border were saying the same thing in different words. Sovereignty is not only about who rules, it's about who repairs. For decades, independence had been defined by flags, anthems, and the rhetoric of defiance. But the real measure of a nation is not how loudly it declares itself free, but how quietly it defends what it builds. In that sense, Ghana and Burkina Faso were not in conflict. They were in negotiation with history. What the headlines called a standoff was actually an education. The lesson was simple but radical: Africa's greatest enemy is not invasion, but erosion, the slow, invisible decay that follows neglect. When a country begins to protect its roads, it is also protecting its dignity. Under the blazing Sahel sky, soldiers and mechanics worked side by side to unload the excess cargo. The images seemed mundane: men sweating, steel clanking, engines groaning, but beneath that effort lay the same principle that had guided Niger's campaigns: precision, patience, preservation. The fight for freedom had evolved. It was no longer fought in deserts, but on highways, no longer measured in victories, but in maintenance. In Bobo Dioulasso, a trader watching the news said quietly, "We are learning to take care of what is ours." That sentence, carried through radios and cafes, spread like a whisper of maturity. Across the continent, it resonated, from Niamey to Accra, from Ouagadougou to Tamale. a signal that the new revolution of Africa was not one of gunfire, but governance. The foreign press misread it again. Economic tension, they said. Infrastructure dispute. They could not recognize the language of accountability because they had never expected Africa to speak it. For generations, the world had watched this continent build, break, and rebuild. Now, it was watching Africa pause, and that, somehow, was more shocking than any war. When the last truck crossed the border that night, a soldier standing watch looked up and murmured, "It feels different this time." He couldn't explain why. Perhaps because for the first time, restraint had replaced rebellion. Or because, for once, the Sahel had enforced a rule that was its own. Whatever it was, the silence that followed wasn't tense. It was dignified. By dawn, the road was clear. The sun rose over both nations, casting long shadows of the same trucks that had nearly sparked outrage a day before. The air was thick with heat, but also with a kind of quiet pride, the pride of responsibility. No border collapsed. No soldiers died. No foreign envoy intervened. And yet, something profound had shifted. Africa had argued with itself and ended stronger. Across the radio frequencies, the message replayed, new regulations to preserve national roads. To outsiders, it sounded procedural. To Africans, it sounded sacred. Because the true weight of unity isn't in how we march together, but in how we endure together. The footage of the reopened road looped across television screens, then faded into another headline. But in the minds of those who lived it, something remained, a new awareness that sovereignty is not inherited. It must be maintained daily. And far to the east, in Niamey, that same awareness was taking shape under different skies. The lesson of the border had become the logic of a continent, that power without responsibility is a shorter road to ruin than any invasion. As the dust settled over the Sahel once more, a quiet truth remained. That Africa's awakening would not be declared in speeches or battles, but in the small, deliberate acts of nations learning to protect their own foundations. And in that discipline, to finally trust themselves. The dust over the Sahel began to settle, but it did not rest. It hovered, waiting, like breath held between heartbeats. Something in the air had changed. The sound of command no longer came from distant capitals or foreign briefings. It came from within. The wind that once carried orders was now carrying answers. Across the horizon, the faces of leadership were changing. They were not polished politicians trained in the etiquette of compliance, nor generals waiting for instructions from abroad. They were men forged in scarcity, tested by storms, molded by fire. And they had begun to speak with the same cadence as the land itself, measured, relentless, and unafraid. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traore stood before the people, not behind podiums but among them. He did not read from notes. He spoke like a soldier who had seen too much to pretend. "We will not kneel," he said. "Not to hunger. Not to fear. Not to the illusion of partnership that keeps us in chains." His words were not rhetoric. They were recognition, that freedom without strength is theater. And strength without purpose is tyranny. Burkina Faso had found its compass again, and the world could feel its pull. In Niamey, Abdourahamane Tchiani's government spoke with the tone of engineers rather than revolutionaries. Their language was logistics, energy, infrastructure, not ideology. The Republic, newly steady after the campaigns of Damissa, Almahaou, and Niger, was recalibrating its power from the ground up. It no longer asked who had influence over the Sahel, it asked who could sustain it. In Bamako, Assimi Goïta walked through military academies rebuilt by local architects. "We are not rebuilding barracks," he said, "we are rebuilding belief." His generation was not romantic about sovereignty. They understood it as mathematics, input, effort, endurance, outcome. For decades, Africa's leadership had aged but not matured. Power was inherited, not earned, borrowed, not built. Now, a new rhythm was emerging, the sound of youth not as rebellion, but as renewal. These leaders were not fighting to be admired. They were fighting to be effective. Western commentators struggled for language. They called them populists, nationalists, even authoritarians. But their labels fell flat against the reality that this generation had inherited nations half-built, half-owned, and wholly exhausted. Their defiance was not vanity, it was necessity. The Sahel had become the testing ground of modern African identity, a crucible where revolution met reconstruction. Traore's call for dignity, Tchiani's discipline, Goïta's pragmatism, each carried a fragment of the same realization: sovereignty is not a single act of liberation. It is the daily labor of self-respect. The young lions of the Sahel were not roaring for chaos. They were roaring to remind the world that the continent was awake, alert to manipulation, allergic to pity, and hungry for coherence. In Accra, a journalist asked a simple question: why are these men so young? The answer, though unspoken, was everywhere. Because the old world had run out of excuses. They were born into debt, drought, and disorder, raised in countries told they were too fragile to function, too poor to think for themselves. But fragility breeds adaptation, and adaptation breeds intelligence. What the world saw as desperation, they turned into discipline. The camera zoomed in on Traore's face during one of his rare interviews. He didn't smile. "They say we are angry," he said. "We are not angry. We are awake." That line became a chant across social media, painted on walls in Ouagadougou, quoted in classrooms in Niamey. We are awake. Meanwhile, in Niamey, the new Ministry of Energy, born from the ashes of foreign contracts, began building a refinery not for export, but for survival. The goal was clear: stop selling resources cheap. Start powering the nation. Oil is not wealth until it feeds your own people, one engineer said on state TV. The audience clapped softly, not for the line, but for the logic. In Bamako, farmers received the first batch of state-subsidized fertilizers under a local program named Terra Nova. Its motto read, "From soil to sovereignty." It was not poetry, it was policy. The revolution was no longer in speeches, it was in systems. In cafes, markets, and campuses, conversations changed. Young Africans no longer asked, "Who will save us?" They asked, "Who will serve us, and how long before we serve ourselves?" The irony was not lost on historians. The very regions once used as proxies for foreign influence were now producing the most disciplined forms of self-rule. And while the old elites whispered about risk and rebellion, the people on the ground were living a quieter kind of order, the order of necessity. Across the Sahel, flags flew not as ornaments but as reminders. Not of what was given, but of what was reclaimed. For the first time, the word unity no longer sounded like a dream. It sounded like work, hard, honest, unfinished work. As one Burkinabe poet wrote, "We have no saviors, only mirrors. And in them, we see the faces we were waiting for." In that reflection, Africa was beginning to recognize itself again. Not as a story told by others, but as an author with pen in hand. The world watched with skepticism, expecting collapse. But collapse did not come. Instead, systems began to hold. Not perfectly, but persistently. The young lions were not promising paradise. They were promising participation. And that, after centuries of being managed, lectured, and contained, was revolution enough. By night, in Ouagadougou, soldiers returned to their barracks without fanfare. The streets were calm. On a balcony nearby, a grandmother whispered to her grandson, "This feels different." He nodded, not because he understood politics, but because the air felt heavier, like the world had stopped overlooking them. From Niamey to Bamako, from Ouagadougou to Accra, a new idea was spreading, that leadership is not measured by age, but by authenticity. That the youngest nations on earth deserve leaders who match their urgency, not their excuses. And if the old order could not understand that, then perhaps it was never meant to. If this vision of a self-reliant Africa stirs something in you, let it. Because history does not need approval, it needs witnesses. And every witness who believes in dignity becomes part of its proof. But every revolution, no matter how noble, casts a shadow. And in the glow of Africa's awakening, another kind of war was quietly unfolding, the war without uniforms, without borders, without sound. It did not begin in battlefields, but in boardrooms. It wasn't waged by soldiers, but by signatures. Contracts disguised as cooperation. Loans wrapped in friendship. Proposals that promised progress but carried the weight of possession. In Niamey, as the new Ministry of Energy celebrated the refinery's construction, documents began to circulate, memorandums from foreign investors, offering assistance, expertise, partnership. The language was soft, the intent was not. Beneath every clause was the same old condition: surrender the control, secure the capital. They called it development. But those who could read between the lines saw a pattern older than colonization itself, the attempt to turn sovereignty into a subscription. For decades, Africa had fought visible empires. Now, the enemy came wearing suits, not medals. They didn't need to conquer land, they just needed to own what ran beneath it. Oil, uranium, lithium, the arteries of the future. The refinery in Niger was not just an industrial project. It was a test. Would the republic power itself, or be powered by permission? A senior advisor described it plainly: this time, the invasion came with contracts. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traore warned in one of his speeches, the war for Africa's future will not be fought in deserts, but in documents. His voice was measured, but the message was fire. The people understood. They had seen what comes after aid, dependency disguised as progress. Across the Sahel, ministers began to speak in new terms: resource sovereignty, economic defense, energy independence. The words felt revolutionary because they were. For centuries, Africa's wealth had been extracted in exchange for debt. Now, for the first time, the continent was asking a forbidden question: what happens if we say no? The answer was swift. Offers turned into pressure. Diplomacy hardened into threat. A Western diplomat was overheard saying, "They won't last without us." But the tone of Africa had changed. It no longer begged for approval, it negotiated from necessity. In Niamey, a reporter leaked a memo from a European conglomerate proposing a joint management model for Niger's refinery, meaning, in truth, joint ownership. The proposal was rejected within a day. The response was one sentence long: "Our sovereignty is not for sale." Those 5 words rippled across the region like a shockwave. It wasn't defiance, it was declaration. The same kind of silence that once preceded battles now followed this decision, the silence of clarity. Because this was the invisible war, the quiet struggle over who writes the fine print of the future. No blood spilled, no flags changed. Only the terms of survival. And as the sun sank over the Sahel, one truth became impossible to ignore: that the real fight for freedom would not be won by armies, but by awareness. The front lines had shifted from deserts to decisions, from trenches to tables. Some wars roar. This one whispered. But its echoes would decide everything that came next. The desert remembers every footprint. From Dosso to Ouagadougou, from Niamey to Accra, the same wind carries the same vow. Never again will Africa be silent about its own destiny. The old chains have changed their shape, but the hands that break them are stronger now. A new covenant is being written, not in treaties or loans, but in will. The Sahel has spoken. It speaks through its roads, its refineries, its classrooms, its borders. It speaks through leaders who refuse to bend and citizens who refuse to forget. And when the next storm comes, as it always does, they will not run. They will stand where their fathers fell and finish what their mothers began. If this spirit reaches you, carry it forward. Like, share, speak, not for numbers, but for memory. Because stories fade when silence wins. And silence has ruled long enough. Now it's our turn, to keep the fire burning. To guard the soil. And to remember who we are.